Welcome to another episode of the Bible Explained. As with every episode, I like to open things up with humility. As long as we continue to remember this, we don't ever need to be humbled. Not that we can't be. So it's important to remember humility when we study this. Just because you understand one thing and other people don't doesn't make you better. It just means that you have privilege of teaching them. Let's start off. I'm very thankful to the Lord for providing me these avenues. 20 years ago, this stuff would have never existed, so pretty amazing the technology that exists today. We're going to begin this study by talking about Genesis chapter 2. We left off chapter 1. The last time was the discussion of the creation of earth, specifically the heavens and earth, and how all of that stuff ended up happening. So we start chapter 2 and we jump right into it, and we talk about a little recap of what happened. And the first verse is going to be, "Thus the heavens and earth were completed in all their vast array." And as with this series, we like to analyze every single sentence and a lot of the words in the sentences. So thus, basically meaning, you should probably refer to the previous sentence and chapter overall. So if you started in chapter 2, you missed quite a lot. You should probably go back. Heavens and earth, which means that there's two areas. Again, you need to understand that in the context of man, we refer to planets as a whole. We would not say, oh, we have Mars and the heavens of Mars, right? You wouldn't say that. That doesn't make sense. You would say that Mars has a sky. Maybe you would say something like Mars has a hostile environment or something like that, but you wouldn't say Mars is heavens. So this implies that God created the heavens perhaps in heaven or the heavens of earth. Again, it's important to note that the language here is a little bit confusing, but the real takeaway here is that God created earth. And it doesn't just say, "Thus heavens and earth were completed," period. It says in their vast array, which is kind of a modification to add to the splendor of what God has done here. So it's always uplifting, it's always praising, it's always important to understand God created earth, and so in their vast array. We move on to verse 2. "By the seventh day God had finished the work," and he had been doing that work. So on the seventh day he rested from all of his work. A lot of people understand this verse. A lot of people know it. On the seventh day he rested. Even most sinners understand that reference. So clearly it just says he was creating earth, it was taxing, and so he rested. Then we move on to chapter 3. "Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy." And that is very, very important, which means every seventh day is holy. That's not to say that there aren't people out there that can't make other days holy for a specific reason or celebrate on Saturday. The reason that Sunday is holy is because it's the seventh day, but you can make any day holy. There's a big argument. Certain sects of Christianity have made that very clear that they want to celebrate on Saturday, and you know what? No hate to it. But in most contexts of the world, in most broad interpretations of Christianity, most people understand and recognize Sunday as the day that many religious people celebrate. So you're just making it a little bit harder on yourself if you want to recognize Saturday or Monday through Friday as being the day that God rested and the holy day. Again, this isn't something that's going to get you to heaven. You say, oh, well, actually it was Thursday, so every Thursday we should have the day off, and God rested, and that's how it should be. Doesn't matter. It's arbitrary which day you select, just as long as it's the seventh day. So because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done, That is the explanation for why the seventh day is holy. We really don't need to go into that, but that is the reason he made it holy, because he rested on it. Can you imagine how cool it would be to be God? You know what? I'm going to rest on this rock. Now it's holy. That's a little joke. I don't really think that's how it works, but nonetheless, it's been put in here for you to understand. So that's the recap of Chapter 1. If you missed Chapter 1, once again, I strongly urge you to go back and watch the previous video. Get you a little bit of a rundown, understand some of the wording. It's really important to lay the groundwork and the establishing work for the entirety of the Bible. At some point in time, we will be in Revelation doing the last few chapters, and this will seem like a twinkle of the eye. It'll be so long ago that this occurs. So it should be really important to understand everything that happens in these chapters before moving forward. So we move forward, and from here, after verse 3 of chapter 2, it really starts to focus on Adam and Eve. And I mentioned in the previous video that I'm using the NIV version of the Bible. Most Bibles have the same language. Most Bibles have the same context, but some of them are a little bit different. So if you're really picky about that, I would strongly urge you to switch over to NIV so you know exactly what I'm talking about, but you can use your own. It's not a big deal. You can use King James Version. You can use New King James Version. Things like that. It's not a big deal. Okay, so we're going to continue forward, and we are on the 4th verse. This is the account of the heavens and earth when they were created, when the Lord God made earth and made the heavens. There's nothing to take apart from this other than the fact that it is plainly stating that this is the account of the heavens and earth when they were created. And who created them? Well, the Lord God made earth and heaven. So there's no contest. You can't say, well, I just don't know who made them. Well, there it is. Boom. Verse 5. Now, no shrub had yet appeared on earth, no plant yet had sprung up, for the Lord God had not set rain on earth, and there were no work on the ground. But streams came up from the earth and watered the whole surface of the ground. Then the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed life into his nostrils, the breath of life, and man became a living being. So we need to take apart some of this stuff. If we return back to chapter 1, you remember we were talking about how the Lord was making what we consider today to be the ozone layer in the heavens, and it was interesting, the wording that was used there. But he most definitely wasn't making clouds for it to rain, as that has been specified here. And we are moving backwards slightly to a point where God actually created man. So this should have opened up with a return back to the point where God was creating man. Whatever verse that specifically occurred in, it was in chapter 1. Let us make man in our image. That occurred then. So some people can interpret it and say, well, he was making the spirit of man, so he could do it in the verse 5 of chapter 2. But that's not necessarily true. You have to understand that there's going to be people who are going to view this metaphorically, and they're going to view this literally, and they're going to view this as a timeline that jumps around. So you can view it in any which way, but I just see it as a retelling of the man portion when God created man. So they decided to explain how the Bible as a whole had God create earth, and then step back and say, now this is how man was created. So if you take note, it's important to understand that there was no rain. So we have a perfect world, perhaps, with no rain. Perhaps the work wasn't finished yet. God had finished his labors in creating earth itself, but there was still more to be done. So, man became a living being. Man is dust from the ground. This is the origin story of man. Many people search for it. It's very simple. You just needed to read to verse 5 of chapter 2. There's not much to read here. That's not very far to read into the Bible. So to understand man's origins, you could even go so far as to say it's in chapter 1 when God was saying, let us make man in our own image, but now you know exactly how man came to be. There was no rain. The earth was watered from the ground itself. When God created the earth, the first thing he did was just make it a giant ball of water. So that makes sense. Moving on to verse 8. Now the Lord God had planted a garden in the east, in Eden, and there he put the man he had formed. So now we have the very famous Garden of Eden. A lot of people understand this. A lot of people know this. Again, even sinners and people who do not believe in God, Christ, or any type of religion know about the Garden of Eden. This is where God had put man. Please take note that God put him there. God did not create him there. God created man somewhere else, but he placed him in the garden. That is an important distinction, and it's something that gets glossed over quite a lot. A lot of people think man just came from the Garden of Eden, but no, he was placed there. The Lord God made all kinds of trees grow out of the ground, trees that were pleasing to the eye and good for food. In the middle of the garden were the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. This is an interesting question. Why would God create a tree of knowledge which would grant good and evil? It's almost like the Lord knew man was going to eat that fruit. Not jumping ahead too far, but we all know the story of the fall of man. It's pretty strange that God would do that. But to jump ahead a little bit more, the idea of why God created man in the first place would be to honor himself. Why would he need to honor himself? Because what is a robot's love worth? Something that I have focused on quite a lot. And the question is, if you have a robot and your robot is programmed to love you, then what is the point of love? It doesn't matter. So perhaps the knowledge of good and evil and the tree and being told not to eat of it is a test and was a test. But again, that's jumping a little bit too far ahead. The point is, at this point in time, man has been placed in the garden. Trees are just beginning to grow, and two trees existed specifically, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Verse 10, a river watering the garden flowed from Eden. From it separated into 4 headwaters. This is talking about the explanation of where the Garden of Eden actually achieved its water source. And through this specific verse and the next following verses, we can kind of start to understand where exactly the Garden of Eden is. There's a lot of speculation on it, but the Middle East would be a good assumption for the simple fact that the Middle East has absolutely nothing in it. That would be one of the best guesses, because the Garden of Eden was perfect. It was a beautiful garden created by God specifically on earth. And we have somewhat of a location. And so it being completely and utterly destroyed and devoid of most life nowadays would mean that it would be a cruel irony, a more fitting irony for the fall of man. So it's separated into these 4 headwaters, which are rivers. If you imagine a trident facing down, you might have several skews, and that's exactly what these rivers are. The name of the first was Pishon. Pronunciations aren't my thing. It winds through the entire land of Havilah, where there is gold. Then we move on to verse 12. The gold of that land is good, aromatic resin, and onyx is there also. And that's interesting because it specifically tries to explain what gold is. We would assume that gold would be like a gold bar, something nice and shiny, something to look at. But here it specifically says that it is good aromatic resin. So interesting that it claims that. Interesting use of words. Perhaps the land itself is gold. That is a good land, right? And there's onyx there. Onyx being a very, very strong black stone, a beautiful black stone, but a very, very strong one nonetheless. Again, very strange descriptions for a land. It's not like, oh, this is, you would describe a land, you would say, well, my hometown, it has like lots of trees, it has some hills, maybe a couple lakes. Is there a reservoir? Yeah, there's a reservoir. Does it rain there a lot? Sure, it rains there, occasionally, stuff like that. You wouldn't say, oh, yeah, there's gold in my land and a lot of aromatic resin. Oh, there's also onyx there. Maybe you would say there was an onyx mine. Maybe you would say there's a mountain made of onyx. Or maybe you would say there's a place where you can get gold in that land, but you wouldn't describe it as this. So again, interesting use of words, something that should be very considered as we go through this Bible study. Verse 13, the name of the second river was Gihon. It winds through the entire land of Cush. The name of the third river is Tigris. It runs along the east side of Asher. And the fourth river is the Euphrates. So again, very strange that they decided in verse 12 to try to explain the golden land there, but they didn't explain it on any of the other lands. So again, just an interesting takeaway that you should try to understand and focus on. Verse 15, the Lord God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to work it and care for it. So there you go. Why was man placed into the Garden of Eden? It wasn't for paradise. It wasn't for him to be free to do whatever he wanted in yet. The intent was for him to take care of it and work it for God. So there's the reason that man exists. Verse 16, and the Lord God commanded man, you are free to eat from any tree in the garden. Verse 17, but you must not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat of it, you will certainly die. And so it's really important to understand and unpack these verses here. So again, man has been placed into the garden. He is commanded to work. This is the intention for man to be in the garden. But the Lord God specifically commands and states things that man must do and must not do. He is permitted to eat from any tree there is, with the exception of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They cannot eat from it. I say they because we're going to introduce a woman soon. I should remember myself and mind my wording. I'm sorry, I get ahead of myself sometimes. But this was stated to man specifically first. I know a lot of people think that when man and woman, Adam and Eve, were in the Garden of Eden, God specifically addressed both of them, but he did not. He specifically addressed Adam at this point in time. We shouldn't get ahead of ourselves, so I apologize. The point is that God says man will certainly die. Now, this is something that is very important because at this point in time, this is a complex word. This is a complex idea. Think about it. When you were a child, how long did it take you to understand what death was? When you found out that you could die, what did you think? Were you a little bit scared? Were you a little bit frightened? It seems that this is a complex idea that man knew instantly. So it's curious how much man actually understood. Enough to know complex ideas of this, but not enough to not eat of the knowledge of good and evil. Again, getting ahead of myself, but that's something that should be taken into context, right? Verse 18, the Lord said, "It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him." So the takeaway here is that man should not be alone, and he will make a helper suitable for him. He didn't just say, "I'm just going to make him a helper." He said, "I will make him a helper that is suitable for him," because God could have made him any type of helper, any type of assistant. He could have made a giant tiger that flies around with snakes for a tail. And yeah, he could have helped man. That wouldn't have been a problem. I mean, I use a radical example, but it's just the idea that he could have made anything for him. But he made something that was suitable, because it's not good for man to be alone. Verse 19, now the Lord God formed out of the ground all the wild animals, all the birds in the sky. He brought them to man to see what he would name them, and whatever the man called each living creature was its name. So the man gave names to all the livestock, birds in the sky, and the wild animals. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. This is why we have a lot of the names. But it should be noted that the great flood did purge a lot of these creatures, so who knows how many are around today that actually survived the great flood, and who knows how many are still named what they were named by Adam, for so much time has passed. But the good Lord brought them over to Adam. So you should try to understand this also. So he said all of the wild animals formed from the ground and the birds of the sky. He did not say the fish, because a lot of people try to make that connotation. Well, how do fish come out of the ground? He didn't, and they didn't. And this is something that's also important to be noted, because if they were on a lakeside of any kind, then God would have brought the fish to him, because they would have been able to reach him through the water source. Maybe if they were at the ocean side, lakeside, seaside, where these creatures could still live in the water while Adam named them, which is man. And the idea here is that because God brought all these creatures to man, they did not hurt Adam. They did not hurt man. The tigers, the snakes, the cobras, the very dangerous animals we have, the giant bears, perhaps of the time. This is, again, speculation, because it only says the creatures, the birds of the sky, and the animals that were wild, that were formed out of the ground. It does not specifically say which ones. So, again, we're still on verse 20. But for Adam, no suitable helper was found. Now, in verse 19 and 20, it does not specifically state that this was what God was doing, but in verse 18 it is alluded to that. I will make a helper suitable for him. It is alluded that God is not creating a helper, but rather taking the wild animals and birds from the sky and saying, these guys right here can help you. Which one do you want to help you, right? But for Adam, no suitable helper was found. Again, we get the name Adam there, right there. Adam, which is, again, or the man. That's a reference that should be noted, because before it's always been man, man, man. There's very few references to Adam at this point in time, but here is one. Verse 21, so the Lord God caused the man to fall into a deep sleep, and while he was sleeping, he took one of the man's ribs and then closed up with a place of the flesh. And so this one just ascribes and explains how God was creating the helper. He takes a piece of the rib. Why would he take a piece of the rib if he can just create man from dust? This is an idea that perhaps man wanted to be more connected, because God had already created all these wild animals, all these birds, but he saw that none of them were suitable and realized that if he had created something else out of the ground, perhaps it too would not be suitable. So, verse 22, the Lord God made a woman from the rib he had taken out of man, and he brought her to the man. And so it goes on to explain in verse 23, the man said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, and she shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man." And this is the important thing to understand. This is the important context. This connects Adam with the woman that was created. This makes them a more suitable person, because this is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. And that is the important reason why woman was created for man in the Garden of Eden. Moving on to verse 24, that is why man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. So again, we're talking about something in the future known as marriage. We're not talking about the legalistic definition of marriage, but rather that a person will leave their family, a person will leave their mother and father to go get a wife, right? So this is important. Most people would recognize this, but whoa, hold on, wait a second. Who is father and mother at this point in time? God is the father who created man. Who is mother? There is no mother. So this is a reference. This is something that would be referenced in the future for somebody who is reading this to understand the reason why we would leave our parents and go find somebody to be with to create our own family. This isn't a telling from every single verse and perspective that this is happening right here, right now. This is like a first-person viewpoint. This is a historical telling. This is more like this is exactly what happened, and I'm going to sprinkle in some references here and there, and we're going to take a step back. Again, please realize that this is exactly what the Bible does, and it does it a lot of the time. And so here we are, father and mother being referenced in chapter 2. There is no mother at this point in time, no mother figure. It is just God who created Adam and Eve, so that's the reference to the future, and this is why we unite with a wife. You take a woman, you stay with the woman, that is your wife. It's not in terms of a ceremony, it's not in terms of a legalistic ceremony. It is just that you become one instead of two. So we're going to move on, and we're going to close off the chapter here with chapter 25. Adam and his wife were both naked, and they felt no shame. So that's where it's going to close off at. What is no shame? Why would they feel no shame? And why were they naked? Well, because they're in the Garden of Eden. There is no reason to be wearing clothes. Who would be the tailor? What clothes would exist at the time? And when you are naked, most people do feel shame, but that's a social construct. You see naked kids run around all the time. They run around naked all day if they could, for the most part. And they wouldn't feel any shame. You know why? Because they don't have that in them yet. They don't have the maturity to understand and know that they should be clothed. Hey, I'm naked. I should put clothes on. So it's the same with animals. Animals won't feel shame if they are naked because they don't understand why they should clothe themselves. They don't have that knowledge yet. And that's kind of foreshadowing for what's going on, what's going to happen. They were both naked. They felt no shame because they didn't need to feel any shame at this point in time. So that's going to be chapter 2. I hope you guys enjoyed us with the Bible explained here. If you guys have questions about what occurred in chapter 2, I would love to see them in the comment section down below. As with all things, I usually try to respond to comments, but, you know, for the most part, I think a good open discussion with fellow commenters is more important than my interpretation of things, because I've already given you my interpretation. I am filled with a lot of bitterness. I am filled with a lot of anger, and Jesus soothes that and calms it and allows me some peace in my life. Without Jesus, I would have no peace. So feel free to pray the sinner's prayer. We are all sinners, and we all need Christ. I believe that Christ intervened for me. I believe when judgment comes, Christ will represent me, and Christ died for my sins. That's what I believe. And if you believe that in your heart too, you will have representation when judgment comes. Remember, nobody's immortal. At some point in time, we're going to die, and, I'll see you on the other side as you will see me. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you have a blessed day, and I hope to see you next week for the next one.